For decades, the world looked at Africa and thought they understood its conflicts, its struggles, its victories, its pain, and its history. But hidden deep beneath the stories the world tells, there lies a different kind of battle. A war that never appeared on television, never made headlines, never entered history books, and never received global attention. A war that shaped nations, changed borders, redirected economies, and silently influenced the future of an entire continent. This is the secret war Africa never spoke about. And today, the silence breaks. The story begins not on a battlefield, not with armies marching, and not with gunfire. Instead, it begins in quiet rooms, in government offices, in underground bunkers, in remote villages, and in private negotiations where decisions were made that would affect millions of people without their knowledge. This war wasn't fought with tanks or missiles. It was fought with information, minerals, alliances, deception, influence, and power. It was fought between governments, corporations, intelligence agencies, rebel commanders, and foreign powers hiding behind friendly agreements. And the most shocking part is this: many Africans lived through it without ever knowing it was happening around them. The first sign of this secret war began in the early 1960s, when African countries started gaining independence. But independence came with a price. When colonial governments withdrew, they did not leave quietly. They left behind spies, secret agreements, hidden debts, and powerful networks built to keep control indirectly. This quiet struggle became known among a few African leaders as the shadow conflict, a war where foreign governments tried to maintain power without appearing on the front lines. But Africa was not just being controlled, it was being pulled apart by forces that wanted different things. Some foreign powers wanted Africa's minerals, others wanted its ports, others wanted political loyalty, and some simply wanted Africa to remain weak, divided, and dependent. So they fueled rivalries, supported certain leaders, armed rebel groups, created secret operations, and influenced elections. But for ordinary Africans, nothing seemed unusual. Life continued. Markets opened, music played, children went to school, and behind it all, the silent war grew stronger. As the decades passed, this hidden battle intensified. The Cold War brought new tension. The United States and the Soviet Union fought fiercely for influence across the continent. But again, they didn't fight directly. They used African soil as a chessboard. They sent weapons, advisors, and intelligence units. They supported governments they liked and destabilized those they didn't. Conflicts in Angola, Congo, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Somalia were not just civil wars, they were proxy battles in this silent global competition. African soldiers fought and died, but the hidden hands pulling the strings belonged to outsiders. Meanwhile, African leaders who understood what was happening were faced with impossible decisions. Some resisted, some collaborated, some disappeared, some were overthrown in coups that were planned not inside Africa, but thousands of kilometers away in foreign rooms. But the war was not only foreign. Africa had its own internal battles that fed into this silent conflict. Ethnic tensions, power struggles, corruption, and weak institutions became fuel for manipulation. When two African groups fought, foreign powers would pick sides, sending resources to whichever side best served their interests. But the world never saw this war. They saw only the surface, the chaos, the poverty, the fighting, without knowing who was controlling what from behind the scenes. Then came the battle for minerals. Africa holds some of the richest resources on Earth: cobalt, gold, diamonds, oil, uranium, copper, gas, and rare earth metals that power the world's electronics, military devices, and transport systems. Those resources became weapons in the secret war. Foreign companies entered Africa pretending to help develop communities. Instead, they extracted billions of dollars in minerals while leaving locals with nothing. Agreements were signed in languages villagers did not speak. Mines were dug in areas villagers did not approve. Leaders were bribed. Governments were pressured. And slowly, global powers tightened their grip on Africa's wealth without ever firing a bullet. Meanwhile, African activists who tried to expose these deals were arrested, silenced, or mysteriously disappeared. And still, the world believed Africa's problems were simply internal. But this silent conflict did not only involve foreign powers. Some African leaders learned how the game worked and decided to play it to their advantage. They made deals with outsiders in exchange for weapons, money, and political protection. They used those resources to suppress rivals, control the military, and remain in power for decades. But history hides the details. What people saw were long-serving leaders. What they didn't see were the secret agreements that kept them there. Then came the technological chapter of the Silent War. This one was invisible to the eye. No soldiers, no explosions, no front lines. Instead, attackers used cyber tools, digital surveillance, online propaganda, and data manipulation. Foreign intelligence agencies hacked African systems. African governments spied on their own people. Corporations collected data on millions of Africans without consent. And gradually, information became the new battlefield. Whoever controlled the flow of information controlled the power. But the war was still in the shadows. Ordinary citizens had no idea a digital conflict was unfolding right in their pockets through their phones, apps, and networks. As China entered Africa, the battle took a new turn. China built roads, ports, hospitals, and infrastructure, projects that looked like help. And many of them were helpful. But behind some deals were secret clauses, hidden dependencies, and influence strategies designed to put China ahead in the global race for power. The United States, Europe, Russia, and the Middle East responded by tightening their own influence. Soon, Africa was at the center of a competition bigger than anything the continent had ever seen. A new form of Cold War. But still, it was silent. Not one African news channel called it a war. Not one government announced it. It continued quietly, slowly shaping the continent's future, until one event exposed everything. A massive intelligence leak revealed documents showing that at least 12 foreign countries had been secretly influencing African decisions for over 50 years. The documents showed bribes, manipulation, exploitation, secret meetings, military involvement, economic pressure, and even assassinations of African leaders who refused to cooperate. When the leak became public, people were shocked. African citizens realized they had been part of a conflict they never saw. Leaders denied involvement. Foreign governments denied responsibility. Corporations denied wrongdoing. But the evidence was too strong. The silent war was real, and parts of it were still happening. After the leak, researchers began digging deeper. They uncovered stories that had been hidden for decades. Stories of spies sent into African capitals to influence policy. Stories of rebel groups secretly funded by foreign agencies. Stories of minerals smuggled out of the continent with government approval. Stories of leaders who refused to obey foreign powers and were removed in covert operations Stories of media outlets paid to shape how Africans thought. Stories of elections influenced without anyone realizing it. The deeper they dug, the more disturbing the truth became. Africa had been a silent battleground for global power, and the battles were still ongoing. In the next phase of this war, the battlefield shifted again. From minerals to technology, Africa became the testing ground for new digital systems, mobile banking, surveillance tools, biometric ID programs, and AI-powered governance platforms. These technologies brought benefits, but they also brought new risks. Foreign tech companies gained access to African data. Governments used new tools to monitor citizens, and the silent war expanded into cyberspace. Hackers targeted African banks. Intelligence agencies hacked African ministries. Criminal groups attacked African businesses. Hostile nations used disinformation to spark tension between African communities. And yet again, the public never saw it as war. But experts did. They saw Africa becoming the center of a quiet competition for digital control. Then came the battle for the future: renewable energy, climate resources, water, and land. As the world began searching for new energy sources, Africa became a target. Countries rushed to sign secret deals for lithium, cobalt, solar land, and hydroelectric projects. In many cases, African communities were pushed aside. Land was taken, forests were cleared, water sources were redirected, but the world called it development. In reality, it was another chapter of the silent war, control through green energy. African youths began studying these events. They connected the dots and realized that the continent had been shaped by invisible hands for generations. They saw the pattern clearly. Whoever controlled Africa controlled the future. And suddenly, the silent war became visible to those who paid attention. It was no longer about borders. It was about influence. It was no longer about armies. It was about information. It was no longer about land. It was about resources and data. It was no longer about guns. It was about deals signed in secret. Africa began understanding that it was fighting not one war, but many at once. A war for minerals. A war for political influence. A war for technology. A war for economic direction. A war for data. A war for identity. And a war for control. And still, no leader ever declared this war. But the consequences were everywhere. The turning point came when African scholars and journalists started exposing the truth, publishing reports that made the invisible visible. They revealed how foreign governments controlled key African infrastructures. They exposed multinational corporations exploiting minerals while leaving communities in poverty. They uncovered secret military agreements hidden from citizens. They traced money trails showing how African politicians were influenced. They exposed foreign agents disguised as businessmen, diplomats, and advisors. These revelations shook the continent. For the first time, Africans saw the full picture of the war that had been shaping their lives for generations. But here is the most shocking part. Despite the manipulation, despite the exploitation, despite the silent battles fought in boardrooms and intelligence offices, Africa was still rising. The continent's young population, its growing technology ecosystem, its cultural influence, and its natural resources, and its strategic position made it the future battleground for global dominance. And this time, Africans were no longer blind. They knew the silent war existed. They knew power was shifting. They knew foreign powers still wanted control. But they also knew something else. Africa now had leverage, knowledge, and unity growing stronger than ever. The war might be silent, but Africa was no longer silent, and the world could no longer pretend not to see. This is the story of the secret war Africa never spoke about. The war that shaped nations without a single official declaration. The war fought through influence, not invasion. Through deals, not battles. Through silence, not explosions. But today, the silence has broken, and the truth is finally in the open. The question now is simple. With the truth revealed, who will shape Africa's next chapter? The hidden hands of the past, or the rising voices of Africa's future?